Male officer slaps a black MP in court. He freezes seconds later as she knocks him out cold. You think that badge makes you a god in this room, Officer Hayes? You're nothing but a coward hiding behind state-sanctioned violence. The courtroom gasped. Officer Ronald Hayes' face turned a violent shade of crimson. Shut your mouth, you arrogant, he snarled, lunging across the mahogany table. Crack. His heavy hand struck MP Naomi Pierce's face, the sound echoing like a gunshot. For 2 agonizing seconds, Hayes froze, a triumphant smirk forming on his lips. He expected tears. He expected fear. Instead, Naomi slowly turned her head back. Her eyes were utterly dead. And then, she moved. The air inside courtroom 4 of the Royal Courts of Justice was thick, suffocating, and heavy with the unmistakable stench of a brewing storm. It was a miserable Tuesday in London, the rain lashing aggressively against the towering, Gothic-stained glass windows, casting fractured, melancholic light across the oak-paneled walls. But the real storm was entirely indoors, concentrated in the tense, electrified space between the witness box and the prosecutor's bench. Seated with impeccable, almost intimidating posture was Naomi Pierce, the Member of Parliament for Southwark. At 38, she had built a reputation that made the political establishment deeply uncomfortable. She was brilliant, unapologetically black, and possessed a mind like a steel trap. Before her entry into politics, Naomi had served 2 tours as an investigator with the Royal Military Police. She knew how to dismantle a target, whether with a carefully worded subpoena or, if the situation ever demanded it, with her bare hands. Today, her weapon of choice was a stack of meticulously organized manila folders, each containing damning evidence of police corruption. In the witness box sat Officer Ronald Hayes. He was a bruising, hulking figure of a man, a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police. Hayes belonged to an old, fading era of law enforcement, the kind that believed the streets were a personal fiefdom and the uniform was a license for absolute impunity. His neck, thick and flushed with chronic high blood pressure and bubbling rage, bulged over his collar. He was currently the prime focus of an independent inquiry into the catastrophic failings and deep-rooted corruption of Operation Trident, a specialist anti-gang unit. Naomi was leading the inquiry, and for the past 3 hours, she had been systematically flaying him alive on the public record. Officer Hayes, Naomi's voice was remarkably calm, carrying a cold, resonant clarity that cut through the stifling room. Let us revisit the events of October 14th. You claimed in your official report that the suspect, a 19-year-old boy with no prior convictions, resisted arrest with extreme prejudice. Yet, the CCTV footage from the local off-license, which, I might add, mysteriously vanished from the evidence locker but was recovered by my office from a cloud backup, shows him lying on the ground, hands secured behind his head, for a full 2 minutes before you initiated physical force. Hayes shifted his massive weight, the antique wooden chair groaning in protest. He gripped the edges of the witness stand, his knuckles turning white. He hated her. He hated her tailored navy suit, her flawless locks pulled back into a severe bun, and most of all, he hated the absolute lack of deference in her eyes. To a man like Hayes, a black woman holding authority over him, demanding accountability from him, was a fundamental violation of the natural order of his world. I stand by my report, Hayes ground out, his voice a low, gravelly threat. In the heat of the moment, on the streets, you don't have the luxury of playing Monday morning quarterback, Miss Pierce. It's Member of Parliament Pierce, or ma'am, Officer Hayes, Naomi corrected smoothly, not missing a beat. And we are not discussing the heat of the moment. We are discussing a calculated, brutal assault on a restrained teenager. An assault that left him with a fractured orbital bone and permanent vision loss. You falsified the report to cover your tracks. You believed you were untouchable. The gallery behind them, packed with journalists, legal aides, and the families of Hayes' victims, began to murmur. The presiding judge, an elderly man named Justice Aris, tapped his gavel weakly. Order. Let us maintain decorum. Hayes' face was now a mottled, furious purple. Sweat beaded on his forehead, catching the dim courtroom light. He leaned forward, spit flying from his lips. You politicians are all the same. You sit in your ivory towers in Westminster, reading reports, while we bleed on the pavement. You don't know the first thing about survival. Naomi didn't flinch. She simply turned a page in her folder, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden, tense quiet. I know quite a bit about survival, Officer Hayes. I also know a bully when I see one. A coward who only exerts force when he holds every advantage. When the target is unarmed. When the target is outnumbered. Let's look at Exhibit F, shall we? A string of text messages from your personal phone, detailing. Those are fabricated. Hayes roared, his voice cracking with panic and rage. The mention of his personal phone, a burner he thought was completely untraceable, shattered his remaining composure. The illusion of his invincibility was crumbling on live television, dismantled piece by a woman he viewed with utmost contempt. The boiling point had been reached, and the pressure valve was about to violently explode. The explosion came without warning, fueled by decades of unchecked ego and a sudden, desperate realization that his career was dying in real time. Hayes couldn't logically argue his way out of the evidence Naomi Pierce was presenting. The text messages she held were the undeniable nail in his coffin, proving not just brutality, but a coordinated conspiracy to plant narcotics on minority suspects to boost arrest quotas. Stripped of his power to intimidate legally, Hayes reverted to the only language he truly understood, physical dominance. I said, shut your mouth. Hayes bellowed. In a movement shockingly fast for a man of his bulk, he shoved the heavy wooden gate of the witness box open. The hinges screamed. Justice Aris slammed his gavel down, shouting, Officer Hayes, remain seated. But Hayes was already moving. He crossed the 3 yards separating the witness box from Naomi's desk in 2 massive strides. Court bailiffs, caught entirely off guard by the sheer audacity of an officer attacking an MP in the Royal Courts of Justice, scrambled forward, but they were seconds too late. Naomi stood up, instinctively squaring her shoulders, her face a mask of absolute calm. She didn't retreat a single inch. You arrogant, Hayes snarled. He drew his right arm back, his massive hand open, and swung with all his might. Crack. The slap was sickeningly loud, a sharp, violent sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the vast, vaulted room. The sheer force of the blow snapped Naomi's head violently to the side. A collective, horrified gasp erupted from the gallery. Reporters dropped their pens. A woman in the front row screamed. Time seemed to stop. For 2 agonizing, breathless seconds, Hayes froze. He stood there, chest heaving, a terrifying, triumphant smirk slowly forming on his lips. His eyes gleamed with a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and vindication. In his warped mind, he had just restored the natural order. He had put her in her place. He expected her to collapse, to clutch her face in tears, to cower before him in terror as so many others had done in dark alleys and interrogation rooms. But Naomi Pierce did not cry. She did not cower. Slowly, deliberately, Naomi turned her head back to face him. Her cheek was already swelling, a bright, angry red mark forming the exact shape of Hayes' hand. A thin trickle of blood escaped the corner of her mouth where her teeth had cut into her lip, but it was her eyes that made Hayes' smirk falter. There was no fear in them. There was no shock. There was only a cold, dark, terrifying void, the eyes of a predator who had just been handed the perfect justification. In her mind, Naomi's Royal Military Police training, honed through years of close-quarters combat drills, took over completely. She analyzed Hayes' stance in a fraction of a millisecond. His weight was entirely on his front foot, his right arm was still dropping from the follow-through of the slap, and his chin was thrust forward, completely unguarded. He was wide open. Big mistake, Naomi whispered, her voice barely carrying over the chaotic din of the courtroom, yet dripping with lethal intent. She didn't wind up. She didn't telegraph her movement. Power generates from the ground up, a lesson drilled into her 1,000 times on the mats. Naomi planted her right foot, twisted her hips with explosive, coiled torque, and unleashed a devastatingly precise left hook. The mechanics of the punch were flawless. Her fist, small but tight as a cannonball, connected squarely with the hinge of Hayes's jaw. The impact sounded like a baseball bat striking a heavy sack of wet sand. Thwack. The physics of the human body are unforgiving. When the jaw is struck with that much rotational force, the brain violently twists inside the skull, instantly shutting down the nervous system to protect itself. Hayes didn't stagger. He didn't stumble. The lights simply went out. His eyes rolled back into his head, exposing the whites. His knees buckled instantly, turning his massive frame into dead weight. 240 pounds of corrupt muscle plummeted directly downward. His head struck the edge of the mahogany prosecutor's table on the way down with a sickening thud, before he crashed onto the historic, tiled floor of the courtroom. He lay there, limbs splayed awkwardly, completely unconscious, drool already pooling from his slack mouth. The courtroom, which had been in a state of chaotic uproar, was instantly plunged into a deafening, stunned silence. Nobody moved. The bailiffs, who had been rushing to intervene, skidded to a halt, staring wide-eyed at the crumpled giant on the floor. Naomi stood over him. She calmly reached into her breast pocket, pulled out a monogrammed linen handkerchief, and dabbed the blood from the corner of her lip. She looked up at the pale, trembling judge. "I believe, Your Honor," Naomi said, her voice steady and echoing clearly through the silent room, "the witness is currently incapable of answering further questions. I request a brief recess." The immediate aftermath was a blur of flashing lights, frantic shouting, and unprecedented legal chaos. Within minutes, paramedics swarmed courtroom 4, gingerly loading the still unconscious Officer Hayes onto a stretcher, strapping a neck brace around him due to the impact with the table. Outside the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand, the media circus had mutated into a frenzy. News helicopters hovered like vultures, satellite trucks blocked traffic. The footage of the incident captured by the courtroom's official broadcast cameras had leaked online within 20 minutes and was spreading across global social media like a digital wildfire. Inside Portcullis House, the modern office building housing MPs opposite the Palace of Westminster, Naomi Pierce's office was functioning like a war room. Her chief of staff, a frantic young man named David, was pacing a hole into the carpet, a phone pressed to each ear. "Yes, she's fine. No, we are not issuing an apology. Are you out of your mind?" He hit her first. David yelled into one phone before hanging up and turning to Naomi. "That was the Prime Minister's office. They want to know if you're pressing charges, and they're begging us to de-escalate the rhetoric before the city riots." Naomi sat behind her desk, holding an ice pack wrapped in a towel to her throbbing cheek. She looked remarkably serene for a woman who had just sparked a national crisis. She took a slow sip of her Earl Grey tea. "Tell the Prime Minister I have no intention of de-escalating." Hayes escalated when he assaulted an elected official to stop a corruption inquiry. "Let the fire burn. It will illuminate the rats." Meanwhile, in a private room at St. Thomas's Hospital, Ronald Hayes was waking up. His head felt like it had been split open with an axe. He groaned, the sound morphing into a sharp yelp of pain as his broken jaw protested. Standing at the foot of his bed was Graham Stoker, the head of the Police Federation, the powerful union that had protected bad cops like Hayes for decades. Stoker was a slimy, pragmatic man who saw this disaster not as a failure, but as a PR opportunity. "Easy, Ronnie," Stoker said, his voice slick. "You've got a mild concussion and a fractured mandible. She hit you with a cheap shot. A sucker punch." Hayes blinked, the memories flooding back, the humiliation, the blinding flash of her fist. She knocked me out," he mumbled through wired teeth, his ego bruised far worse than his jaw. "A bloody politician put me on the floor." "No, Ronnie. Listen to me," Stoker said, leaning in closely. "A radical, anti-police extremist violently attacked a decorated officer who was suffering a mental health episode due to the extreme stress of a witch hunt inquiry. That's the angle. We are spinning this. We're going to destroy her. We're filing charges against her for grievous bodily harm. We'll say you tripped and she took advantage of your vulnerable state." Hayes managed a painful, malicious grin. Yeah, that's it. Ruin her, Graham." By 6 p.m., the spin machine was in full effect. Stoker held a press conference outside the hospital. Looking gravely into the cameras, he condemned the savage, unprovoked martial arts assault by MP Pierce against a dedicated public servant. He demanded Naomi's immediate resignation and arrest, framing her as a dangerous vigilante who hated law and order. Right-wing tabloids immediately picked up the narrative, running front-page headlines like, "Pierce the Punisher? MP brutalizes cop." The political establishment, always cowardly in the face of police union pressure, began to distance themselves from Naomi. Talk shows debated whether she had used excessive force in her self-defense. The narrative was shifting, turning the victim into the aggressor, a classic tactic used against those who dared challenge systemic power. Sitting in her office, watching Stoker's press conference on the television, David looked terrified. "Naomi, it's working. They're controlling the narrative. They are going to get you arrested. We need to release a statement expressing regret for the violence." Naomi lowered her ice pack. The swelling made her look fierce, battle-tested. She picked up a secure, encrypted flash drive from her desk and tossed it to David. It landed in his hands with a heavy click. "I don't do regrets, David. And I don't fight PR battles with press releases," Naomi said, a dangerous, predatory smile finally gracing her lips. "I fight them with hard, undeniable data. Book me on BBC Newsnight for tomorrow evening. Live interview, prime time. And send the contents of that drive to our trusted contacts at The Guardian and the BBC. Let Mr. Hayes and his union dig their grave a little deeper before we bury them in it." The tension in the BBC Newsnight studio was palpable. It was Wednesday evening, 24 hours after the slap heard round the world. The nation was glued to their screens. The host, a veteran journalist known for his relentless grilling, sat opposite Naomi Pierce. Naomi wore a sharp, crimson suit. She had refused makeup over her bruised and swollen cheek. She wanted the country to see exactly what Hayes had done. "MP Pierce," the host began, leaning forward. "The Police Federation has officially filed charges against you for grievous bodily harm. They claim Officer Hayes was suffering a panic attack, reached out for balance, and you responded with a highly trained, lethal strike. How do you justify that level of violence?" Naomi looked directly into the camera, her gaze unwavering. "I justify it as the right of any human being to defend themselves from an enraged, 240-pound man launching a physical attack, but let's not play the Federation's games. Ronald Hayes didn't trip, he struck me because I cornered him. I was about to expose the deepest rot within the Metropolitan Police, and he panicked." The host frowned. "You claim you have evidence of this rot. Yet the official police database shows no such records." "Of course it doesn't," Naomi replied smoothly. "Because corrupt officers do not log their crimes on official servers. But they do make mistakes." Naomi reached into her pocket and placed a small, shattered smartphone on the glass table. "This is Officer Hayes' true personal device. A burner phone he believed he destroyed by running it over with his squad car before the inquiry began. What he didn't know is that the memory chip survived." Naomi's eyes locked onto the camera lens, speaking directly to Hayes and Stoker wherever they were watching, "And what he also didn't know is that my team employed top-tier forensic data recovery experts." The host looked stunned. "What is on that phone, MP Pierce?" "Everything," Naomi said, her voice ringing like a bell tolling for the corrupt. Audio recordings of Hayes explicitly coordinating with local gang leaders to distribute seized narcotics, text messages instructing junior officers to turn off their body cameras before raiding the homes of innocent immigrant families, and, most chillingly, a recorded phone call between Hayes and Graham Stoker, head of the Police Federation, discussing how to permanently silence a whistleblower within their own ranks. The studio fell dead silent. The live broadcast feed was beaming this unmitigated disaster directly into millions of homes. Naomi wasn't finished. This was the twist she had been holding on to, the ace up her sleeve. Furthermore, she continued, her tone turning to ice, "I anticipated Hayes would attempt to spin the narrative of the assault in the courtroom. Which is why, prior to the hearing, I requested and received authorization from the highest levels of MI5 for a covert surveillance measure, given the suspected level of organized crime infiltration in Operation Trident." The host swallowed hard. "A covert measure?" "Yes," Naomi said calmly. The courtroom cameras caught the wide angle, but the microphone in the lapel of my suit, which was actively recording and transmitting to a secure government server, caught the audio of him whispering, "I'm going to break your neck, you black," just a fraction of a second before he struck me. She leaned back, resting her hands on the table. He wasn't having a panic attack. It was a racially motivated, premeditated assault intended to intimidate a government official. The audio files, the phone data, and the evidence of the Federation's complicity have already been handed over to the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Independent Office for Police Conduct. Across London, in a lavish hotel room, Graham Stoker watched the broadcast, the color draining from his face until he looked like a corpse. His phone began to ring incessantly, the media, the government, the furious public. It was over. The spin had failed. In his hospital bed, Hayes watched the same broadcast. The smug confidence that had buoyed him for decades evaporated in an instant, replaced by a cold, hollow terror. He realized, with crushing clarity, that Naomi Pierce hadn't just knocked him out physically. She had lured him into a trap of his own arrogance, let him strike the match, and then handed him the dynamite. She had systematically, legally, and utterly annihilated his life. 6 months later, the landscape had fundamentally changed. The fallout from Naomi's BBC interview had been catastrophic for the corrupt elements of the Metropolitan Police. Operation Trident was entirely disbanded. Graham Stoker was forced to resign in disgrace and was currently under federal investigation for obstruction of justice. But the main event, the spectacle the entire country had been waiting for, was the criminal trial of Ronald Hayes. Hayes was no longer in his police uniform. He sat at the defendant's table in courtroom 1 of the Old Bailey, the highest criminal court in the land, wearing an ill-fitting gray suit. The man was a shadow of his former hulking self. He had lost 30 pounds. His posture, once dominating and aggressive, was now slumped, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The psychological breakdown of a bully who had been stripped of his badge, his gun, and his power was absolute. He was facing charges of corruption, conspiracy to distribute narcotics, perjury, and the racially aggravated assault of an elected official. The courtroom was packed, but this time, the atmosphere was different. There was no chaotic energy, only the grim, inevitable march of justice. Naomi Pierce sat in the gallery, watching the proceedings. Her presence alone seemed to radiate a gravitational pull that kept Hayes terrified. The prosecution's case was a masterclass in legal dismantling. They played the audio recordings from Hayes' recovered burner phone. The jury, a diverse cross-section of Londoners, listened in disgusted silence, as Hayes' recorded voice laughed about planting a knife on a Somali teenager. They listened to the frantic, panicked calls to his union boss. And then, they played the enhanced audio from Naomi's lapel microphone. The vile, racist slur hissed by Hayes just before the sickening crack of the slap echoed through the historic arches of the Old Bailey. Hayes' defense barrister tried a desperate, floundering strategy. He attempted to argue that Hayes was a product of a broken system, suffering from severe PTSD from his time on the streets, and that the assault was a momentary lapse in judgment caused by provocation. It was Naomi's turn to take the stand as the star witness for the prosecution. She walked to the witness box with the same calm, intimidating grace she had shown 6 months prior. MP Pierce, the defense barrister began, sweating profusely. "You are a trained combatant. Is it not true you deliberately provoked my client, knowing you could physically overcome him, in order to create a public spectacle?" Naomi looked at the barrister, her expression pitying. "I presented documentary evidence of his crimes. If facing the truth of his own actions is what provoked him, then yes, I provoked him. As for creating a spectacle, I simply allowed the public to see the monster that had been hiding in their uniform." But the punch, the barrister pressed, grasping at straws. Was it necessary to strike him with such devastating force? "You shattered his jaw in 3 places. I used the exact amount of force necessary to neutralize an immediate, violent threat to my person," Naomi replied, her voice cold and absolute. "He is a man twice my size who had already struck me and threatened my life. I neutralized the threat. The fact that his jaw was fragile is a medical issue, not a legal one." A few people in the gallery stifled laughs. Even the judge hid a small smile behind his hand. The defense rested shortly after, defeated. When Hayes was asked to take the stand in his own defense, he refused. The man who had spent 20 years shouting down suspects, coercing confessions, and bullying the weak, found that he had absolutely nothing to say when faced with undeniable truth and a jury of his peers. He sat in silence, staring at the floor, finally understanding what it felt like to be entirely helpless. The jury took less than 2 hours to deliberate. It was one of the fastest verdicts for a case of this magnitude in the Old Bailey's history. Guilty on all counts. The day of sentencing was cold and overcast, a fitting backdrop for the final act of Ronald Hayes' downfall. Justice Aris, the same judge who had witnessed the slap in the civil inquiry, had recused himself, and the case was handed to the formidable Judge Beatrice Vance, known for her zero-tolerance policy on police corruption. Ronald Hayes, Judge Vance's voice rang out, sharp as a guillotine blade. Stand up. Hayes stood on trembling legs. He clutched the wooden railing of the dock to keep from collapsing. For 2 decades, you were entrusted with the power of the state. You were given a badge and a mandate to protect the vulnerable, Judge Vance read from her prepared statement, her eyes blazing with contempt. Instead, you operated as a predator. You targeted the marginalized, you falsified evidence, ruined innocent lives, and enriched yourself while hiding behind a thin blue line that you yourself painted with corruption. Hayes squeezed his eyes shut, a tear leaking out. It wasn't a tear of remorse, it was a tear of pure self-pity. Your assault on MP Pierce was not an aberration, it was the final, desperate act of a tyrant realizing his reign was over. You struck a woman, a person of color, and a representative of the democratic process, believing your uniform granted you immunity from the laws of physics and the laws of men. You were violently disabused of that notion. Naomi watched from the front row. She felt no joy, only a profound sense of necessary closure. For the charges of conspiracy, corruption, perjury, and racially aggravated assault, Judge Vance declared, her gavel raised high, I sentence you to 22 years without the possibility of parole. You are stripped of your pension, your honors, and your title. The gavel slammed down. Bang. It sounded like a cell door slamming shut. Hayes let out a pathetic, choked sob as the court policemen who used to call him brother stepped forward to place him in handcuffs. They were not gentle. They hauled him away, out of the light of the courtroom and into the dark bowels of the justice system. 3 days later, a prison transport van pulled up to the imposing, heavily fortified gates of HMP Belmarsh, a men's prison in southeast London. It housed the most dangerous criminals in the country, many of whom were serving time because of the corrupt tactics of the Trident Task Force. The heavy iron doors groaned open, swallowing the van. Inside the holding area, Hayes was stripped of his civilian clothes and forced into a standard-issue gray tracksuit. The guards processing him offered no smiles, no winks, no professional courtesy. He was just another inmate now. Number 84729. As he was marched down the stark, fluorescent-lit corridor of A wing towards his cell, the noise of the prison washed over him, a cacophony of shouts, banging metal, and chaotic energy. Then, someone recognized him. Yo, look who the cat dragged in, a voice echoed from a cell on the second tier. It belonged to a young man Hayes had framed for weapons possession 5 years ago. The whispers started, traveling down the cell block like electricity. It's Hayes. The dirty cop. The one the MP knocked out. Faces pressed against the small barred windows of the heavy steel doors. Eyes filled with years of stored hatred locked onto him. The men he had beaten, framed, and stolen from were waiting. The jeers began, followed by the terrifying sound of hundreds of hands banging rhythmically on the metal doors. Boom. 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 Hayes stopped walking. His breath hitched in his throat, his knees shook so violently the guards had to drag him the rest of the way to his cell. They tossed him inside and slammed the heavy door shut. The lock clicked with a horrifying finality. Ronald Hayes backed into the corner of his tiny, concrete cell, surrounded by the deafening, predatory noise of the men he had wronged. He curled his knees to his chest, burying his face in his hands. The badge was gone. The power was gone. He was entirely alone, trapped in a cage with his own hard, inescapable karma. Out in the city, the